Welcome to today's Explainer, guys. Today, we're going to unpack one of the absolute most bizarre and honestly terrifying industrial disasters in American history. I'm talking about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. But look, today we aren't just doing a dry review of the historical facts. No, we're zooming in. We're looking at this strictly from the perspective of the survivors and the incredibly dramatic, just desperate rescue efforts of the people who had to somehow live through it. Okay, so put yourself directly into this moment. It's Boston, January 1919, and it's a surprisingly warm winter afternoon. People are out, maybe just enjoying the uncharacteristic break from the bitter cold. The neighborhood is totally bustling with the sounds of everyday life. You've got horses clopping on the pavement, the rumble of the elevated railway nearby. It feels entirely normal. But looming over all of this everyday activity is something massive.
50 feet tall. That is the height of a colossal storage tank towering right over the streets. I mean, imagine walking down your own block right now, looking up and seeing a structure 5 stories high, just casting this giant, ominous shadow right over the sidewalks.
And it wasn't empty. Inside that towering metal cylinder was a staggering, almost unimaginable volume, over 2 million gallons of molasses. That is millions of pounds of incredibly dense, heavy, viscous syrup suspended directly above a populated neighborhood on a warm afternoon.
Then, suddenly, with absolutely zero warning, the tank ruptures with catastrophic force. And what erupts out of it? It isn't a trickle. No, it is a tidal wave 25 feet high. Think about that. A solid wall of dark, sticky liquid 2.5 stories tall, completely blotting out the sun as it just crashes down onto the streets below. And it is moving incredibly fast, 35 miles per hour. If you are a pedestrian on the street that warm January afternoon, you have absolutely zero time to react. You literally cannot outrun this. A massive wall of heavy syrup is hurtling toward you at highway speeds.
Section 1. A viscous tidal wave.
Imagine the sheer blunt force trauma of that initial impact. Remember, this wasn't water. The unbelievable weight and explosive speed of the molasses literally crushed buildings outright all around you. The thick metal girders of the elevated railway snapped like little twigs. Instantly, people, horses, carts, they were all swept off the street, just caught in this violent churning torrent that tore through the entire neighborhood in a matter of seconds.
Section 2. The hardening trap.
Now, the warm temperature that afternoon played a really cruel role here. At first, that warmth is exactly what allowed the 2 million gallons of molasses to flow incredibly fast, causing all that outright blunt force destruction. But as the sun began to set, the liquid cooled. And as molasses cools, it changes completely. It stops being a fast-moving wave, and it turns into a thick, suffocating snare. So anyone who survived that initial wave, they were now physically glued to the wreckage.
Section 3. A desperate rescue effort.
When first responders arrived, they found their neighborhood completely unrecognizable. It was, quote, a chaotic and tragic struggle for survival. This wasn't your standard rescue operation. Rescuers were physically fighting just to wade through the thick, hardening substance. Every single step they took was a grueling, exhausting battle against the cooling syrup, as they desperately tried to free victims who were completely immobilized and trapped under the debris.
Section 4. The sticky aftermath.
So that immediate, harrowing need to navigate the hardening trap eventually gave way to a really prolonged agony for the city. It literally took weeks of massive effort. We're talking intense manual labor, washing, scraping, and digging just to clean up the wreckage. The entire infrastructure of the neighborhood was coated in this relentless, immovable layer of syrup. Section 5. The lasting legacy. The disaster obviously started with that violent rupture in January, and it transitioned into weeks of exhaustive cleanup. But the memory? Well, that lingered for decades. In fact, for generations afterward. Locals claim that on particularly hot summer days, a faint, sweet smell of molasses would just waft through the air. The disaster literally seeped into the pores of the city, leaving this very strange, permanent scar. But the legacy wasn't just a lingering smell, right? It forced real historical change. This tragedy triggered one of the very first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts, and it proved in court that this wasn't just some random act of God, but a massive failure of oversight. Crucially, it forced companies to implement much stricter engineering and safety standards for industrial storage across the board. So think about it. We walk past industrial sites, water towers, and massive storage tanks all the time, and we completely trust the engineering behind them.
But the next time you look at modern industrial safety standards, will you remember the tragic, sticky wave of 1919? It's a pretty powerful reminder that the regulations keeping us safe today were very often born out of the chaotic, deeply human struggles of the past. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on this crazy piece of history. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.